There is a name that has traveled for 1,000 years, and it did not travel alone. Somewhere behind every Anderson, every Nielsen, every Halvorsen and Bjornsson, there is a person who lived before writing reached the north, before churches kept records, before anyone thought to ask where a family truly began. The name survived. The story attached to it did not. For generations, families with Scandinavian surnames have told themselves a simple version of their own history. Viking blood. Pure Norse lineage. A direct, unbroken line running back to longships and raiding parties and gods carved into stone. It is a clean story. It is also, researchers now suggest, largely a myth, not because the Viking Age wasn't real, but because what it left inside the genome is far stranger and far more human than the legend allows. Then the DNA arrived, and the map of who these families actually descended from began to shift beneath their feet. For centuries, the accepted history was straightforward. Scandinavian surnames, patronymic names built from a father's first name, place-based names tied to a farm or fjord, occupational names describing a trade, were treated as ethnic markers. If your name ended in "son" or "son", the assumption followed automatically: Norse ancestry, Viking ancestry, a lineage rooted entirely in the northern peninsulas since time immemorial. Historians and genealogists built entire family narratives on this assumption. Church records, when they existed, reinforced it. A name passed from father to son for hundreds of years looked, on paper, like proof of an unbroken biological thread stretching back to the Viking Age itself. It was a tidy system, and it matched what people wanted to believe about themselves: that identity could be read directly off a surname, that ancestry was a straight line rather than a tangle. It made sense. It was also, historians now admit, never designed to describe biology at all. Patronymic naming was a social convention, not a genetic record. And that distinction would turn out to matter more than anyone expected. The first cracks appeared quietly, in the kind of detail that looks like nothing until it is placed beside everything else. Genealogists working through parish registers began noticing something odd. Surnames that seemed purely Scandinavian showed up attached to burial records with unexpected artifacts, trade goods from the British Isles, jewelry styles associated with the Baltic, grave goods that echoed Slavic craftsmanship rather than anything native to Norway or Sweden. Names that sounded like they belonged to Old Norse farming families sometimes appeared in coastal trading towns known to have absorbed captives, merchants, and settlers from far outside Scandinavia. Oral tradition added another layer of friction. In parts of Iceland and the Faroe Islands, family stories occasionally referenced ancestors from the West, a phrase historians long dismissed as folklore, until it started appearing suspiciously often in families whose surnames carried the deepest, most authentically Norse pedigree. Something was off even before the major reveal. A surname could describe where your ancestor's name came from. It could not describe where your ancestors' ancestors came from. And the Viking world, it turned out, was already more mixed than the sagas ever admitted. This is where genetics entered the story, not to confirm the old narrative, but to test it against a record no parchment could forge: the genome itself. Unlike written history, DNA does not get edited by later generations trying to shape a cleaner story. Y-chromosome DNA, passed almost unchanged from father to son, offered a way to trace direct paternal lines, the same lines that patronymic surnames were supposed to track. Mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child, offered a second, independent thread, revealing maternal ancestry that surnames never recorded at all. And autosomal DNA, the broad mixture inherited from both parents, allowed researchers to reconstruct something closer to a full ancestral portrait, not just one narrow line of descent. Ancient DNA extracted from Viking Age skeletons made this even more powerful. For the first time, scientists could compare the genomes of people who actually lived during the Viking Age to the genomes of modern Scandinavians carrying the same surnames those Vikings might have used. The old story was no longer being tested against assumption. It was being tested against the dead. If you find this kind of hidden history detective work as fascinating as I do, consider subscribing, because almost every population on Earth is carrying a story more complicated than the one it was told. What the DNA revealed did not simply confirm the Viking myth. It complicated it layer by layer. The first surprise was internal. Genetic diversity within the Viking world itself was far higher than expected. People buried in Scandinavian soil, under Scandinavian grave. Customs, speaking what was presumably Old Norse, carried significant ancestry from outside Scandinavia entirely. Southern European lineages, ancestry linked to what is now the British Isles, and genetic signatures associated with populations to the east, near the Baltic and beyond. The Vikings, it turned out, were never a single genetically uniform people. They were already a blend before they ever raised a sail. The second surprise was even harder to reconcile with the old story. Some individuals buried with full Viking weaponry, in graves unmistakably marked with Norse ritual and Norse identity, carried little to no close genetic connection to Scandinavia at all. Viking identity, the evidence suggested, was not purely inherited. It could be adopted, absorbed, or claimed by people whose ancestry originated somewhere else entirely. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. The story did not collapse, it widened. There are, researchers suggest, several explanations that together may account for what the genome is showing, and none of them cancel the others out. One possibility is large-scale admixture. Viking raiding, trading, and settlement routes stretched from Ireland to the Volga, and wherever ships went, people moved both ways. Captives brought north, settlers pushing outward, generations of intermarriage folding new ancestry into old family lines long before anyone wrote a surname down. A second possibility involves what geneticists sometimes call a ghost population, genetic ancestry detectable in the data, statistically present and undeniable, but not clearly matched to any single well-documented ancient group. Traces of ancestry that don't fit neatly into Norse or Anglo-Saxon or Slavic categories, hinting at populations that moved, mixed, and dissolved into later groups without leaving a clean archaeological signature behind. A third possibility is cultural absorption without full genetic replacement, meaning that becoming Viking in the Iron Age North may have functioned less like a bloodline and more like a citizenship. Language, custom, and burial rites spreading faster and further than biology ever did. Each of these explanations survives contact with the evidence. None of them alone explains all of it. And that, historians now argue, may be the most accurate description of the Viking world available, not one origin story, but several, running in parallel. The most decisive evidence came from a landmark study published in Nature in 2020, led by researchers who sequenced hundreds of Viking Age skeletons recovered from across Scandinavia, the British Isles, and sites farther east, one of the largest ancient DNA surveys of the period ever assembled. This was not a handful of isolated samples. It was a broad comparison panel spanning centuries and thousands of kilometers, cross-referenced against modern populations carrying Scandinavian ancestry today. The finding that mattered most was this: genetic ancestry associated with the Viking Age did not spread as a single wave from a single homeland. It arrived in overlapping pulses from multiple directions, over a period long before the raids that made the Vikings famous. By the time the Viking Age is conventionally said to have begun, the ancestral mixing that would define it had, in important ways, already happened. The twist was not that Scandinavian families had some foreign ancestry mixed in at the edges. The twist was where, specifically, some of that ancestry pointed, and how deep it ran. Certain lineages carrying deeply Norse-sounding patronymic surnames trace paternal Y-DNA to haplogroups whose oldest concentrations sit not in Scandinavia at all, but farther south and east, regions tied to the broader Indo-European expansion that reached the north thousands of years before the Viking Age even began. Meanwhile, maternal mitochondrial lines in some of the same families point toward ancestry connected to the British Isles, evidence, researchers suggest, of women brought north during the very raids their descendants would later claim as purely their own heritage. Not the ancestry these families expected. Not even the region they expected. The genome was not erasing the Viking story. It was revealing an older, wider story underneath it, one where Scandinavian was never a fixed starting point, but a convergence zone where older migrations settled, mixed, and eventually forgot they had ever been anything else. Why does this matter beyond 13 surnames and one Nordic peninsula? because it points to something true about nearly every population that has ever been given a tidy origin story. Human history does not move in straight lines. It braids. People migrate, intermarry, get absorbed, get erased from the written record, and reappear generations later as an unremarkable line in someone else's family tree. A surname can preserve a name. It cannot preserve a bloodline untouched by everyone that name ever encountered. Scandinavian identity, DNA suggests, was never a sealed container. It was a long conversation between the people already living in the north and every group that ever sailed, walked, or was brought into contact with them: Baltic traders, British captives, Sami neighbors, southern merchants, and older Bronze Age populations whose names we will never recover. Picture, for a moment, the world that produced these names. A fjord in early spring, ice breaking loose from the shoreline in long gray sheets. Longhouses with smoke rising through turf roofs. A harbor crowded with ships that had returned from Dublin, from the Rhine, from trading posts along rivers that led east into lands whose names Norse sailors barely knew how to spell. Children with fathers who had never set foot in Scandinavia, growing up speaking Old Norse, worshipping Norse gods, being given Norse names, because that was the world they were born into, regardless of what their blood carried from somewhere else. That is the world where these 13 surnames took root. Not a fortress of pure ancestry, but a harbor. A place where the outside world kept arriving, generation after generation, and calling itself home. If your family carries one of these names, the DNA does not diminish that inheritance. It expands it. You are not descended from a single, uninterrupted Viking bloodline stretching back into myth. You are descended from a much larger and more improbable story: Baltic sailors and British mothers, southern travelers and northern farmers, 1,000 small unions across 1,000 years, all funneling down into a name your family has carried, mostly unaware of everything that name was quietly holding. The old story was not wrong because it was too dramatic. It was wrong because it was too small. The truth the genome preserves is stranger than the legend, a story of contact, absorption, and reinvention that no saga ever fully wrote down, because the people living it didn't think of themselves as evidence. They just thought of themselves as home. The map of Viking ancestry is still being redrawn, sample by sample, genome by genome. And every surname on that map is a small, unfinished sentence in a story far older than any of us assumed. If you want more of these hidden ancestry investigations, let me know in the comments which name, or which population, you'd like uncovered next.